Before we delve into the shadows of what you are about to read, a moment of warning. The story that follows is one of profound darkness, a descent into a depravity so bleak it threatens to extinguish the very light of human nature. It is a tale of calculated cruelty and unimaginable horror that transpired in a place forgotten by the world, a place where the barks of dogs drowned out the silent screams of the lost. The details are graphic, and the truth is disturbing. We believe in shedding light on such darkness, not for shock, but for remembrance, and as a stark reminder of the monsters that can walk among us, cloaked in quiet solitude. If you are a seeker of truth, a believer that these stories must be told, then we ask you to support our channel. Please, take a moment to click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By doing so, you help us continue to give a voice to the voiceless and ensure that the victims of these terrible acts are never forgotten. Now, prepare yourself. We are about to unearth the chilling crimes of the dog farm. The town of Havenwood Creek was a place that clung to the edge of the map like a stubborn burr on a wool coat. Nestled deep within the rolling, unforgiving hills of the Appalachian backcountry, it was a community stitched together by a single winding road, a handful of weathered storefronts, and a shared, unspoken agreement to mind one's own business. Time in Havenwood didn't so much march forward as it did seep, slowly and silently, into the cracked pavement and the rotting timbers of old barns. It was a town where secrets could be planted, and with enough quiet patience, they would grow deep roots, undisturbed in the dark, fertile soil of collective indifference. And on the furthest outskirts of this isolated community, where the paved road crumbled into a gravel track that snaked up into the dense, whispering woods, lay the most profound of Havenwood's secrets. It was a sprawling, dilapidated property known to the locals simply as Hemlock's Farm. It wasn't a farm in the traditional sense. No corn grew in its fields, no cattle grazed its pastures. The only thing Silas Hemlock cultivated was dogs. Dozens of them. The sound of the place was its most defining feature. It was a constant, low rumble of canine discontent that would rise and fall with the passing of the sun. At dawn, it was a chorus of hungry, demanding barks that echoed through the misty valleys. At night, it was a cacophony of howls and snarls that bled into the chirping of crickets, a soundtrack of primal menace that kept the nearest neighbors, a good 2 miles down the ridge, from sleeping too soundly. The dogs were a motley, ferocious pack of crossbreeds, mostly large and muscular, with matted fur and eyes that held a feral, unnerving intelligence. They roamed within a series of large, high-fenced enclosures, their forms moving like restless shadows behind the rusting chain link. Silas Hemlock himself was as much a feature of local folklore as the farm. He was a gaunt, stooped figure, with a face that seemed carved from old wood and a mane of greasy, gray hair that fell over his collar. He was a man who had perfected the art of being unseen. His trips into town were rare and fleeting, materializing in the dim light of the general store to buy massive sacks of the cheapest dog kibble, salt, and industrial-grade bleach, his eyes always downcast, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that was barely audible. He paid in cash, his hands calloused and stained, and would be gone before the bell on the shop door had finished its jingle. Rumors about him were Havenwood's favorite pastime, swapped over lukewarm coffee at the diner or murmured between sips of beer at the town's only bar. Some said he was a veteran, driven mad by things he'd seen in some forgotten war. Others whispered he was a fugitive, hiding from a dark past under a new name. The most common theory was that he ran a brutal, illegal dogfighting ring, breeding the animals for pure aggression and selling them to a clientele as shadowy as himself. It was a theory that explained the sounds, the secrecy, and the chilling aura of violence that seemed to hang over the farm like a shroud. But they were just rumors. In Havenwood, as long as a man kept to himself and his troubles didn't spill over onto your land, his secrets were his own. The trouble, when it began, did not spill. It seeped, just like the passage of time in Havenwood Creek, so slowly at first that no one noticed. It started with the travelers, the ones who were just passing through. Young women, mostly, with backpacks and thumbed-out rides, drawn by the romantic notion of escaping the grid and seeing the real country. They were transient, ephemeral figures who would appear at the diner for a meal, their faces bright with the naivety of youth, and then vanish down the road, their departures as unremarked as their arrivals. The first was a girl named Maya. Her face, framed by a cascade of sun-bleached dreadlocks, had been a brief splash of vibrant color in the diner's drab interior. She'd spoken of heading west, of working on organic farms, of living a life untethered. She bought a coffee and a slice of pie, charmed the elderly waitress, and asked for directions to a scenic hiking trail that started just off the old gravel track leading up into the hills. The one that passed right by the entrance to Hemlock's farm. No one saw her again. Her absence was a question mark on a map seen by no one, a ghost on a road that had already forgotten her. A few months later, another girl, this one named Chloe, stopped in town. She was quieter, with a sketchbook full of charcoal drawings of the surrounding hills. She was trying to hitch a ride to the next state over, to meet up with a friend. She was last seen walking along the shoulder of the main road, her thumb hopefully extended, in the direction of the county line. The last car to have passed her before she disappeared from view was Silas Hemlock's battered, rust-eaten pickup truck, rattling back towards his farm after one of his rare supply runs. It was a detail that went unnoticed, a tiny, insignificant piece of a puzzle that hadn't yet been conceived. The disappearances were isolated incidents, separated by months, and the victims were strangers. In the fragmented, disconnected world of law enforcement that covered these rural territories, they were just names added to a long, ever-growing list of missing persons, filed away in different counties, different jurisdictions. There was no one to connect the dots, no one to see the faint, horrifying outline of a pattern beginning to emerge in the quiet hills of Havenwood Creek. That began to change with Sarah. Sarah Jenkins was not a traveler. She was local, or as local as anyone could be who had only lived in Havenwood for 5 years. She was a woman in her late 20s who had moved to the area seeking refuge from a messy divorce and the suffocating noise of city life. She had bought a small, secluded cabin about 1.5 miles down the road from Hemlock's farm, a brave choice that some of the older residents had quietly questioned. She was a freelance writer, which allowed her the solitude she craved, and she supplemented her income by cleaning a few of the small businesses in town twice a week. She was a gentle soul, known for her quiet kindness and the stray animals she was always taking in. It was this compassion that would be her undoing. One of her cats, a ginger tomcat named Marmalade, had a habit of wandering. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the ridges, Marmalade didn't come home for his dinner. Sarah wasn't immediately worried. But when he was still gone the next morning, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. She spent the day calling for him, her voice growing hoarse as it was swallowed by the vast, indifferent woods. She printed a few makeshift lost cat posters at the town library, her hands trembling slightly as she taped Marmalade's picture to the grainy paper. She tacked them to the community notice board outside the general store and on a telephone pole near the turnoff to her road. Deputy Frank Miller saw the poster the next morning. Frank was a man in his late 50s, with a weary face and a paunch that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt. He was Havenwood's sole law enforcement officer, a position that mostly involved settling minor property disputes, dealing with the occasional drunk at the bar, and writing speeding tickets to the few outsiders who didn't know the town's single speed trap. He had known Sarah since she moved to town and had a soft spot for her quiet resilience. He felt a pang of sympathy for her. Losing a pet in these woods was often a permanent affair. Later that day, Frank was on his patrol, a slow, methodical drive around the town's perimeter, when he decided to check on Sarah. He turned onto the gravel track, his tires crunching over the loose stone. As he neared her cabin, he saw her walking along the side of the road, peering into the dense undergrowth, her shoulders slumped in dejection. He pulled up beside her. "Any luck, Sarah?" he asked, his voice a gentle rumble. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "None. I've been looking all day. I'm just so worried about him." "He'll probably turn up when he's hungry," Frank said, offering a weak smile. "Cats are tough." "I know, but I just have a bad feeling," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She gestured up the road, in the direction of Hemlock's property. I'm going to try asking up at the farm. I know he's strange, but maybe he saw something. Marmalade sometimes wanders that far. Frank's smile faded. The thought of gentle Sarah Jenkins approaching that grim, foreboding place made him deeply uneasy. Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea. That fella, Hemlock, he's not exactly the welcoming type. And those dogs of his, they're not friendly. I'll be careful, she insisted, a stubborn set to her jaw. I'll just call from the gate. I have to try everything. Marmalade is all I have. Frank hesitated. He couldn't forbid her from walking on a public road. All right, he said, his voice laced with reluctance. But you be careful, you hear? Don't go onto his property. If he gives you any trouble, you just turn around and walk away. Call me if you need anything. I will, Frank. Thank you, she said, managing a small, grateful smile. Frank watched in his rearview mirror as she continued up the road, her small figure dwarfed by the towering trees that lined the path. The knot of unease in his own stomach tightened. He fought the urge to turn around and order her to get in his car. She was a grown woman, after all. He couldn't protect everyone from everything. He continued on his patrol, the image of her walking towards the barking of Hemlock's dogs replaying in his mind. That was the last time anyone saw Sarah Jenkins. 2 days passed. The cleaning service she worked for called Frank's office. Sarah had missed both of her scheduled shifts without a word, something she had never done. Her car was still parked at her cabin, a dusting of autumn leaves collecting on its windshield. The front door was unlocked. A half-empty mug of coffee sat on her kitchen counter, a silent testament to a morning routine abruptly cut short. Her purse and keys were on the table. The only things missing were Sarah herself and the lost cat poster she had been carrying. Frank Miller felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a feeling that went far beyond the concern for a simple missing person. He remembered their last conversation on the gravel road. He remembered where she was going. He drove back to her cabin, the flashing lights of his cruiser muted by the dense canopy of trees. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground. He found nothing. But as he stood by the edge of the woods, he could hear it, carried on the wind from up the ridge, the constant, hungry barking from Hemlock's farm. He knew he had to go up there. The gate to the farm was a formidable barrier of rusted steel and chain link, topped with jagged coils of barbed wire. A faded, hand-painted sign was wired to the front, the red letters bleeding from years of rain. No trespassing. Beware of dogs. Survivors will be prosecuted. Frank parked his cruiser and approached the gate on foot, his hand resting on the butt of his service revolver. The barking intensified, a furious, deafening roar from at least 30 or 40 large dogs. He could see them through the fence, a churning mass of fur and teeth, throwing themselves against the chain link, their eyes wild and crazed. "Mr. Hemlock!" Frank shouted, his voice nearly lost in the din. "Silas Hemlock, this is Deputy Miller. I need to speak with you." There was no response from the small, ramshackle house that sat 100 yards back from the gate. The windows were dark, like vacant eyes. The only movement was the roiling sea of dogs. "Hemlock, I'm investigating a missing person. I have reason to believe she may have come this way." He waited, the barking a physical pressure against his eardrums. He felt a prickle of primal fear. The sheer aggression of the animals was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. These weren't just guard dogs. They were weapons. After what felt like an eternity, the front door of the house creaked open. Silas Hemlock emerged, wiping his greasy hands on a dirty rag. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes narrowed into slits as he approached the gate. He didn't come all the way, stopping about 20 feet short, forcing Frank to shout. "What do you want, Miller?" Hemlock's voice was a gravelly rasp. "I'm looking for Sarah Jenkins," Frank said, trying to keep his tone steady and professional. "She lives down the road. Hasn't been seen in 2 days. She mentioned she might be coming up here to ask about a lost cat. Did you see her?" Hemlock stared at him, his face an unreadable mask. "Ain't seen nobody," he grunted. "I keep to myself. Nobody comes here." "Are you sure?" Frank pressed. She would have been here 2 evenings ago. A woman, late 20s, brown hair. I said I ain't seen her, Hemlock repeated, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He gestured dismissively at the frothing pack of dogs. You think anyone in their right mind would come up to this gate with that racket going on? She'd have to be a fool. Frank's eyes scanned the area behind Hemlock, searching for anything out of place. He saw piles of junk, rusting barrels, and a large, newly disturbed patch of earth near a row of kennels. A plume of thick, acrid smoke was rising from a makeshift incinerator behind the house, carrying with it a sickeningly sweet, greasy smell that turned his stomach. What's that you're burning, Hemlock? Frank asked, his suspicion mounting. Farm waste, Hemlock said flatly. A sick animal. None of your concern. Frank knew he was at a dead end. He had no warrant, no probable cause. He had a woman's stated intention to walk to this gate and a reclusive man's denial. It was nothing. He couldn't force his way onto the property, not with that army of dogs and a man who was clearly hostile. If you see or hear anything, you call my office, Frank said, his voice hard. Hemlock just stared at him, then turned without another word and shuffled back to his house, the dog's barking subsiding slightly as he passed. As Frank drove back down the gravel road, the sickening smell from the incinerator seemed to cling to the inside of his cruiser. He couldn't shake the image of the disturbed earth or the flat, dead look in Silas Hemlock's eyes. He had been a cop for 30 years, and every instinct in his body was screaming that something was terribly wrong at Hemlock's farm. Sarah Jenkins hadn't just wandered off. She had walked up this road and been swallowed by the silence of the hills. He was certain of it, but he had no proof. He was just one man in a forgotten town, standing at the gates of a private hell, and for now, the secrets of that dark, fertile ground remained safe, guarded by the relentless, hungry barking of the dogs. The investigation into the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins had begun, but the true scale of the horror that lay hidden behind that rusted gate was still a terrifying, unimaginable mystery. The disappearance of Sarah Jenkins sent a tremor through Havenwood Creek. Unlike the transient backpackers who had vanished without a trace, Sarah was one of their own. Her absence left a tangible void. Her face on the missing person flyers, taped to the windows of the general store and the diner, was a constant, nagging reminder that the quiet safety of their isolated town was a fragile illusion. Doors were locked earlier in the evenings, and the friendly waves between neighbors became a little more strained, a little more searching. The woods that surrounded them, once a source of solitude and beauty, now seemed to hold a darker, more watchful presence. For Deputy Frank Miller, the case became a consuming obsession. Sarah's face haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. He was tormented by their final conversation on the gravel road, by his own casual dismissal of her fears. He had told her to be careful, but he hadn't done enough. The thought gnawed at him, a festering wound of guilt and regret. He spent weeks conducting a fruitless search. He organized volunteers from the town, and for a few days, lines of people in bright orange vests swept through the dense woods surrounding Sarah's cabin and the lower portions of Hemlock's property. They found nothing. No scrap of clothing, no footprint, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her whole. Frank interviewed everyone in town, a task that took less than a day. No one had seen anything unusual. The only lead, the only focal point for his gut-wrenching suspicion, was Silas Hemlock. He drove past the farm daily, a silent, one-man surveillance operation. He would park his cruiser at a bend in the road, partially concealed by a stand of pine trees, and watch the farm through a pair of binoculars. He saw little more than the restless movement of the dogs and the occasional fleeting glimpse of Hemlock himself, a shadowy figure moving between the house and the kennels. The man was a creature of rigid routine, his life dictated by the needs of his savage pack. Twice, Frank tried to approach the gate again, hoping to catch Hemlock off guard, to find a crack in his stony facade. Both times, he was met with the same furious wall of sound from the dogs and a cold, dismissive silence from the house. Frustrated and feeling increasingly isolated, Frank decided to dig into Silas Hemlock's past. It was a slow, arduous process. The man had paid for everything in cash, had no credit cards, no social media, no digital footprint whatsoever. He was a ghost in the modern world. Frank had to resort to old-fashioned police work, sending teletypes and making phone calls to records departments in neighboring states, working on the hunch that Hemlock wasn't his real name. After weeks of dead ends, he finally got a hit. A set of fingerprints he had managed to lift from a bottle of bleach Hemlock had purchased at the General Store, a long shot that had required the store owner's grudging cooperation match to set from a 30-year-old military record. The man's name was not Silas Hemlock. It was Samuel Haas. The file that came back was thin, but deeply unsettling. Samuel Haas had been dishonorably discharged from the army. The official reason was insubordination and conduct unbecoming. But tucked away in the file were supplementary reports from his commanding officer that painted a much darker picture. They spoke of a withdrawn, sullen man who displayed a profound lack of empathy. He was obsessively clean and pathologically secretive. The most disturbing detail was a brief mention of an informal investigation into the disappearance of several stray dogs from the vicinity of the base, an investigation that had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but which had unofficially centered on Haas. The report concluded with a chillingly prescient note from a military psychologist. Subject Haas exhibits a detached personality with sociopathic tendencies. He harbors a deep-seated contempt for authority and a disturbing fascination with control and subjugation. He is a man who operates by his own set of rules. He should be monitored, but he hadn't been. After his discharge, Samuel Haas had simply vanished. He had become Silas Hemlock, a ghost who had drifted into the quiet hills of Havenwood Creek to build a new life, a kingdom of rust and chain link where his own set of brutal rules was the only law. The discovery galvanized Frank. He now had a name, a history of disturbing behavior. It wasn't enough for a warrant, not yet, but it was a solid foundation. He began to widen his search, looking for missing person cases in other jurisdictions, cases that had a similar profile. Young women last seen on the road, travelers. He spent his evenings hunched over his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting in his tired eyes, sifting through dozens of case files from across the state and beyond. He found two. A girl named Maya, who had gone missing 18 months prior, last seen in a town 1 county over, telling a waitress she was going to hike the Appalachian Trail, a route that had a spur not 5 miles from Hemlock's farm. And another, Chloe, reported missing by her parents in another state after she failed to arrive at her friend's house. Her last text message had been sent from a location that, when pinged, showed a cell tower whose coverage area included the winding road that passed by Havenwood Creek. Frank felt a cold certainty crystallize within him. This was not just about Sarah Jenkins. This was something far bigger, far more monstrous than he had imagined. He was standing on the edge of an abyss. His investigation, however, had not gone unnoticed. His repeated trips up the gravel road and his pointed questions around town had made their way back to the county seat, and from there to the state police. Frank was a small-town deputy, and a potential serial killer case was far beyond his jurisdiction. He was soon contacted by Detective Isabella Rossi of the State Bureau of Investigation. Rossi was everything Frank was not. She was young, sharp, and impeccably professional, with a reputation for being a tenacious and methodical investigator. When she arrived in Havenwood, her sleek, unmarked sedan seemed an alien presence on the town's quiet streets. Her meeting with Frank was tense at first. He was protective of his investigation, wary of this outsider coming in to take over his case. But Rossi was perceptive. She saw the exhaustion and the guilt in Frank's eyes, and she recognized the value of his local knowledge and the solid groundwork he had laid. She treated him not as a subordinate, but as a partner. "You've done good work, Deputy," she told him, after reviewing his meticulously organized files. "You saw a pattern no one else did. Now, let's get you the resources to follow it through." With Rossi and the power of the SBI behind the investigation, the pace quickened dramatically. They obtained cell phone records for the other missing women. They discovered that both Maya's and Chloe's phones, like Sarah's, had given their last signal from the tower that serviced Hemlock's remote area before being permanently disconnected. It was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence, linking 3 missing women to the immediate vicinity of the farm. Rossi also brought a fresh perspective. She wanted to understand the mind of the man they were hunting. She delved deeper into the military records of Samuel Haas, speaking with the now-retired psychologist who had written the prescient report. The old doctor's words were chilling. "A man like Haas doesn't just love dogs," he explained over the phone, his voice thin and reedy. "He needs them. They offer him unconditional obedience, a sense of absolute power and control that he can't achieve with people. In his mind, they are superior to humans. They are loyal, they don't judge, they don't betray. Humans, especially women, might represent a threat to that control. They can be unpredictable, they can reject him. In a mind as warped as his, he may feel the need to purge that threat, to eliminate the inferior species and reward the superior one." He paused, and his next words sent a shiver down Rossi's spine. "And in the most twisted of psyches, detective, the ultimate act of rewarding the loyal and punishing the disloyal would be to make them one and the same." The implication was so monstrous, so utterly beyond the pale of normal human thought, that Rossi felt a wave of nausea. The constant, hungry barking from the farm took on a new, infinitely more horrifying meaning. Their big break came from an unexpected source. Rossi had tasked a team with a comprehensive search of all financial transactions linked to Samuel Haas, a near-impossible task given his cash-based existence. But one analyst, cross-referencing property tax records, found a detail Frank had missed. Haas had purchased the farm 35 years ago. The deed transfer was a simple cash sale, but the previous owner was a retired veterinarian. Rossi and Frank tracked the old vet down to a nursing home 2 states away. He was in his 90s, his memory a foggy landscape of fading recollections, but when they showed him a picture of a young Samuel Haas from his military file, a flicker of recognition sparked in his rheumy eyes. "The quiet one," the old man rasped. "He used to bring his dog to me, a big, mean-looking brute, always paid in cash." "What was wrong with the dog?" Rossi asked gently. "Nothing usually," the vet replied. "Just checkups. But then, there was the last time. The dog was sick, very sick. Haas claimed it had eaten something bad. I ran some tests. The dog was suffering from severe protein toxicity. The system was overloaded. I'd only seen it once before, in a textbook case about tribes in New Guinea who practiced funerary cannibalism." He looked at them, his old eyes wide with a dawning, 30-year-old horror. "I asked him," I said, "what in God's name have you been feeding this animal?" He just stared at me, cold, flat stare. Then he picked up his dog, walked out, and I never saw him again. A few weeks later, his lawyer contacted me with a cash offer for the farm. I was ready to retire. I took it. This was it. It was the piece they needed. A veterinarian's expert testimony about what Haas was feeding his animals, linked to his known history of psychopathy. It was enough to establish a pattern of behavior so abnormal, so indicative of potential criminal activity, that Rossi was confident they could get a judge to sign off on a search warrant for the farm. She and Frank drove back to Havenwood in a state of grim, silent determination. The vague suspicions and chilling theories had coalesced into a terrifying, plausible reality. They were no longer just searching for missing women. They were hunting a monster who had turned his isolated farm into a personal charnel house. As they prepared the affidavit for the judge, Rossi laid out the plan for the raid. It would have to be a major operation, involving a heavily armed SWAT team. The dogs were a significant, lethal threat. They would need animal control specialists equipped with tranquilizer guns and catch poles. They would need a full forensic team ready to excavate the property. The logistics were complex and dangerous. Frank felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. For months, he had been a lone voice crying in the wilderness. Now, the full weight of the state was about to descend on Hemlock's farm. He thought of Sarah Jenkins, her gentle smile and her quiet courage. He had promised her he would find her cat. Now, he hoped he was finally going to get her justice. The evening before the raid was scheduled, Frank found himself unable to sit still. The waiting was unbearable. He got in his cruiser and, drawn by some grim, invisible force, he drove back up the gravel track one last time. He parked in his usual spot and looked through his binoculars. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. Plumes of thick, dark smoke were once again rising from the incinerator behind the house. The greasy, sweet smell, even from this distance, was stomach-churning. As he watched, he saw Hemlocker Haas emerge from the house. He was dragging something heavy, a large, bulging canvas sack. He heaved it towards one of the dog enclosures. As he reached the fence, he unlatched the gate just enough to slide the sack inside. The dogs, which had been in a frenzy of anticipation, fell upon it with a savage, snarling fury. Frank's blood ran cold. He didn't need to see what was in the sack. He knew. He was witnessing a ritual, the final, profane act in a cycle of unimaginable violence. He watched until the last light of day had faded, leaving the farm silhouetted against the bruised purple sky. He sat there in the darkness for a long time, the sound of the dogs, a sound of frenzied, ecstatic feeding echoing in the profound silence of the hills. The waiting was almost over. Tomorrow they would go in. Tomorrow the world would learn the terrible secrets of Hemlock's farm. The morning of the raid broke cold and gray, a low-hanging mist clinging to the hollows and dampening all sound. It was a morning that felt heavy with unspoken dread. A staging area had been established at the base of the gravel road, a tense and bustling hub of activity that stood in stark contrast to the slumbering quiet of Havenwood Creek. 2 black SWAT vans, a mobile command unit, several animal control trucks, and a fleet of unmarked sedans and forensic vans lined the roadside. The air was thick with the low murmur of radios and the clink of gear as 24 heavily armed officers, clad in tactical black, performed their final equipment checks. Detective Isabella Rossi stood beside Deputy Frank Miller, a large thermos of coffee in her hand, though neither of them was drinking. They watched the proceedings with a shared, grim intensity. This was the culmination of months of tireless work, of sleepless nights and horrifying theories. In a few short hours, they would know if the abyss they had been staring into was as deep and as dark as they feared. "You ready for this, Frank?" Rossi asked, her voice low. Frank nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the mist-shrouded ridge above them. "I'm ready to be done with it," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm ready for him to not be up there anymore." The plan was meticulous. The SWAT team would breach the main gate and secure the perimeter, using specialized acoustic devices long-range sonic canonsto disorient the dogs and drive them back. Animal control teams would then move in with tranquilizer rifles and catchpoles to subdue and contain the animals one by one. Only when the property was clear of the canine threat would Rossi, Frank, and the forensic team make their entry. The primary objective was to apprehend Samuel Haas, alive if possible. The secondary and far grimmer objective was to begin the search for what he had left behind. At 0600 hours, the convoy began its slow, deliberate crawl up the gravel track. The heavy vehicles churned the loose stones, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. As they rounded the final bend, the farm came into view. The barking started almost immediately, not the usual territorial chorus, but a panicked, ferocious roar. Through the chain link, they could see the pack surging back and forth in a state of high agitation, sensing the impending invasion. The lead SWAT van, a heavy-duty armored vehicle, didn't stop at the gate. It rolled forward with deliberate force, and with a screech of tortured metal, the rusted steel gate was torn from its hinges and flattened into the dirt. The moment the perimeter was breached, the sonic cannons mounted on the vans were activated. A high-frequency, deeply unpleasant wave of sound washed over the property. The effect on the dogs was instantaneous and dramatic. The furious barking turned into yelps of pain and confusion. The animals scattered, cowering and disoriented, seeking refuge from the invisible assault. The SWAT team disembarked, a disciplined and formidable force, fanning out to secure the house and outbuildings. As they advanced, the animal control officers moved in, their tranquilizer rifles methodically taking down the confused and frightened dogs. Puffs of compressed air were followed by the soft thud of darts finding their mark. One by one, the snarling, thrashing forms collapsed into twitching heaps of matted fur. The front door of the ramshackle house burst open, and Samuel Haas appeared on the porch, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. He was holding a high-powered hunting rifle. He raised it to his shoulder, but he never had a chance to fire. A chorus of shouts, "Police! Drop the weapon!" was followed by the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle from a concealed position in the tree line. Haas crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering on the wooden porch, a single, precise shot having shattered his shoulder and neutralized him as a threat. "Suspect is down," the radio crackled. "He's alive. Medical team move in." As paramedics rushed forward to attend to the wounded Haas, Rossi and Frank arrived, stepping over the mangled gate and onto the property. The air was thick with the stench of uncleaned kennels, dog waste, and something else. The cloying, greasy smell of the incinerator, now cold, but its foul perfume still lingering in the damp air. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Officers were everywhere, clearing the small house, room by squalid room. The interior was even more derelict than the outside, a hoarder's nest of junk, filth, and stacks of empty, 50-pound bags of dog kibble. But it was what was on the walls that made Frank's blood run cold. Tacked up with rusty nails were dozens of driver's licenses, student IDs, and faded photographs. All of them were of young women. He saw the smiling, hopeful face of Sarah Jenkins from her real estate license. He saw the sun-bleached dreadlocks of the girl he now knew was Maya. He saw the quiet, artistic gaze of Chloe. There were more, at least a dozen others, a gallery of the lost, their faces a silent testament to the horrors that had occurred here. As the property was declared secure, the forensic team, dressed in white Tyvek suits, began their grim work. They sectioned the farm into a grid, their search methodical and painstaking. Frank and Rossi's first stop was the incinerator, a crude brick and steel drum contraption behind the house. Inside, amongst the ash and charred debris, they found the first undeniable proof. Small, calcified fragments of bone, and amongst them, something metallic and partially melted. A collection of zippers from jeans, metal buttons, and the delicate underwire from a bra. The true heart of darkness, however, lay in the large, disturbed patch of earth Frank had noted weeks before. A forensic anthropologist was called in to supervise the excavation. As the team carefully scraped away the layers of soil, the full, sickening scope of Haas's depravity was unearthed. It was a mass grave, but not of intact bodies. It was a jumbled, horrific pit of human remains, a tangled harvest of bones. The bones bore the marks of dismemberment, saw marks on femurs, cleaver chops on vertebrae. They were the parts that Haas had deemed unsuitable for his dogs. The anthropologist worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, her voice calm as she identified the remains. "We have multiple individuals here. Based on pelvic girdle morphology, all appear to be female. The sheer number, it's extensive. They found skulls, 19 of them, buried deeper than the rest, as if they were trophies Haas had kept separate. Each one bore the mark of a single, precise wound. The team worked for hours, then for days, carefully extracting, bagging, and tagging every fragment. From the personal effects found in the house and the sheer volume of remains in the pit, the final tally was horrifying. They had evidence of 20 victims, 20 young women who had ended up here, their lives systematically deconstructed and fed to a pack of savage dogs. While the forensic team toiled, Rossi conducted the interrogation of Samuel Haas at the hospital. He was sullen, uncooperative, and in obvious pain, but his eyes held a glint of arrogant defiance. He refused to speak, refused to acknowledge her presence. It was only when Frank Miller, the small-town deputy he had dismissed as a fool, walked into the room that a flicker of something changed in his expression. Frank didn't ask questions. He simply sat down and placed a single object on the table beside Haas's bed. The small, framed photo of Marmalade the cat from Sarah Jenkins's cabin. "She was just looking for her cat," Frank said. his voice low and heavy with grief. That's all it was. A lost cat. Something in Haas's cold facade finally cracked. He turned his head and looked at Frank, a sneer twisting his lips. They're all just lost animals, Haas rasped, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. Noisy, stupid, disloyal. They come onto my property, they don't follow the rules. They get what they deserve. He looked past Frank, a distant, fanatic light in his eyes. My dogs, they understand. They are loyal. They are pure. They deserve to be rewarded. They deserve the best. It was a confession, not of guilt, but of a profound and unshakable pathology. In his warped, monstrous world, he was not a murderer. He was a keeper of order, a god in his own filthy kingdom, culling the unworthy to feed the deserving. There was no remorse, no flicker of humanity, only the chilling, absolute conviction of his own righteousness. The aftermath in Havenwood Creek was a quiet storm of grief and disbelief. The town had been living alongside a monster, oblivious to the silent atrocities being committed just up the road. The national media descended, their satellite trucks and reporters turning the town's single street into a chaotic circus. The story of the dog farm murders became a lurid, sensationalized tale of rural horror, but for the residents of Havenwood, it was a deeply personal wound. They had failed to see the darkness in their midst, and that collective guilt would hang over the town for generations. For Frank Miller, the closure of the case brought no peace. He had found justice for Sarah, but the cost was a piece of his own soul. He retired a year later, unable to shake the images of what he had seen on that farm, unable to forget the faces of the women on that wall. The dogs, the instruments of Haas's final, unspeakable act of desecration, were all euthanized. They were too aggressive, too conditioned to the taste of human flesh, to ever be rehabilitated. They were, in their own way, the final victims of Samuel Haas's madness. The farm itself was eventually razed to the ground, every structure torn down, every trace of the kennels and the house and the incinerator scraped from the face of the earth. But the land remained, a dark, fallow patch on the edge of town. The woods grew back, but no one ever walked there. The silence that fell over the hills was heavier now, filled with the echoes of the lost. The story served as a chilling, permanent reminder that sometimes the most monstrous secrets are not buried in the distant past or in faraway cities, but in the quiet, forgotten places, hidden just beyond the edge of town, where the only thing you can hear is the barking of hungry dogs.